amazing what the combination of boredom and no sleep can produce because I was up till 1 o'clock in the morning crafting that podcast intro, and it's literally just comprised of primarily three things, which is just random miscellaneous footage. I grew up a huge wrestling fan, so I used part of Chris Jericho's. For those of you that watch wrestling, you remember Chris Jericho, of course. His Titantron, which featured shots of New York City. And for those of you that are familiar with Madonna's work, Ray of Light, which is one of her more popular songs. I used little shots of her video, which primarily was shot in New York City in about 97, 98 or so. And voila, one royalty free beat later and being up until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, we have an intro that's really caught on and become one of the signatures of the show. And welcome back to the show. It's episode 309. Glad you're with us on a really nice March Friday night. The weather was gorgeous today as we're getting a little tease of spring. If you have not checked out the previous episode, that was an interesting one. And that obviously, as you guys know, it's primarily a first responder show, though we dip outside of that on occasion. And we profile a lot of folks on the fire side and certainly the law enforcement side, and particularly when it comes to intelligence gathering too, law enforcement personnel. But we got to look at the private sector aspect of it with Paul DeMatteis, who's done a lot of work with the FBI, helped found John Jay's counterterrorism program, which has educated numerous NYPD personnel. And in 2004, as the global security director for Prudential Bank, helped thwart a terrorist plot to bomb the bank, which he dove into. So that was a very interesting show. Check it out if you have not. We got an interesting show tonight with somebody I grew up watching during her stint on Channel 4 WNBC in New York City. Hello to everybody in the chat before we get to our sponsors. John Costello, of course, retired hostage negotiator and sergeant. Billy Ryan, retired NYPD detective out of the Arson Explosion Squad. Joe Maliga, retired correctional officer, and his better half, Dawn Gonzalez. And Darren Phillips, who's getting it done up in Canada, Vancouver to be exact, as a firefighter. Good to see all of you tonight and all of you watching via LinkedIn and Twitter as well. A couple of ads or sponsors. One, of course, as you know by now, we run it every show. If you need consulting services as it pertains to media, specifically podcasting, I'm your guy. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. And if you need a PI, I mentioned them already, go to Billy Ryan. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike to New Haven podcast. Billy is a good man. He's a collaborator with me on several different projects, including one of our mini-series, which, of course, as you guys know, focuses on retired members of both the Arson Explosion Squad of the NYPD and the Bomb Squad. Now, my next guest has been involved in the media landscape for over 20 years as both a journalist across several different markets, including New York City, where I most remember her from, as well as a very successful consultant. Currently, her own boss is head of Kerry Barrett, Inc. She's utilizing her experiences from over the years to train others on the art of how to be successful on camera. And additionally, you can read her newsletter, as I do, the VIQ Project. And lastly, listen to her podcast, the eponymously titled Kerry Barrett Show. And that as well, Miss Kerry Barrett, who joins me now on the Mike the New Haven podcast. Been watching you for a long time between, of course, your work on Channel 4 and, of course, your consulting work on LinkedIn primarily, where we're connected. So it's good to finally connect here in the podcast, Kerry.
Thank you for inviting me to be a guest. I loved that intro, by the way. I was super impressed with it. I realized it was brand new.
Yeah, no, we've had this for a little bit. When I came back after about a 6-month hiatus to take care of a couple things, I crafted that intro, and it really just puts a new stamp on the show. So we've had that almost for about 9 months now, and it's worked. People love it. People love it. So it's good to roll it out whenever we can. So before we get into your career, tell me, Kerry, where'd you grow up?
Oh gosh, that should be a quick answer. All over the place. I was born in Illinois, then I moved to New Jersey, then I moved to Saudi Arabia, then I moved to Illinois, then I moved to the UK, then I moved to New Jersey, and then South Carolina, Florida, Texas. I'm not growing up at these stages. I'm an adult at this point, at least in theory. Then Arizona, Utah, Philadelphia, and then back up to North Jersey. So I consider myself a Jersey girl. I've spent, like, if you couple all of that together, I've spent the most time in New Jersey, but just not in one place. I back and forth between North and South and kind of Central too.
So if you were assuming you were moving around a lot, of course you moved around a lot, as we'll discuss tonight during your reporting career, but assuming you were moving around a lot as a child, were you a military kid?
Nope. My dad his job was the reason that we moved around quite a bit. He was started as a civil engineer for a multinational company. They built infrastructure, so water tanks, pipelines, oil tanks, that sort of stuff. So that was the bulk of the moving. And then of course my journalism career, as it is wont to do, took me all over the country as well.
Mm-hmm. So growing up seeing different parts of the country and different parts of the world, that could be something that kind of enhances one's perspective to say, I'm seeing so many different interesting different things. I'm meeting so many interesting different people, and you're experiencing different cultures at the same time. Would you say it was there where your love of journalism began?
I think it was, but I didn't recognize it at the time. I actually started my collegiate academic career as a veterinary medicine major. So I wanted to work with horses. I wanted to be a veterinarian for horses, racehorses, etc. About a year and a half in, organic chemistry put a very decisive end to that track, and I sort of like took a little bit of time to figure out what it was that I like to do and what it was that I could potentially be good at. I was not a good speaker. I was terrible. I was terrified, but I did like the stories, I guess. And I didn't think of them in those terms, but sort of like what you were mentioning, you meet different people, rather, you experience different cultures, you learn about different countries and traditions, and just sort of that like behind the scenes look, not as a tourist, but as actually somebody who lived there. I think that inspired my curiosity, and it inspired my love of telling stories. And then I just had to sort of figure out how to cobble the other stuff together, like the actual on-camera part.
As we'll discuss tonight. If you have a question for Kerry in the chat, for those of you watching on YouTube, throw it in the super chat and I'll highlight it at the appropriate time. And thanks again, everybody, for watching. It's interesting because a while ago I had Joelle Garzullo on the show, our mutual friend, and great person, great reporter. Congrats to her, by the way. New gig at Channel 7 on ABC, which I know she'll do fantastic with. But she was mentioning, which I had a very hard time believing, that same thing. As a girl, she was so quiet. Her mother brought her to the doctor because she just never talked.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see somebody that had trouble with that find their way and, of course, be able to convey that. And part of that is just growing out of your shell as you get older. Part of that is schooling. Now, you split it between two places in college, Clemson, University of Florida. I don't know if it was necessarily in that order, but that's where you spent your collegiate years. I always like to ask people this, no matter their profession that they chose to enter into. College is a pivotal place where you get lessons that are still impacting you 20, 30 years, 40 years later, rest of your life, pretty much.
Yeah.
What would you say you learned between the two places that still, both in your journalistic career and your work as a consultant, is still impacting you?
So I did my undergrad at Clemson. I got my bachelor's there, and I got my master's at the University of Florida. A couple of things, actually, and I'll try and keep the answer somewhat abridged. But when I was sort of figuring out what it was that I wanted to do, and I re-enrolled in a communications program. This is at Clemson after I dropped out of my, pre-veterinary medicine track. I had to take a public speaking course, 2 of them actually, which I was hoping would sort of help me get my arms around this really sort of debilitating fear I had around speaking. And it did to some degree. What I will say, though, is that for example, take a public speaking course. Many people watching may have had to take one in college or wherever, and they teach you the art of usually 3 kinds of speeches: informative, persuasive, and then something else. I can't even remember what it was. What they do is they tell you the content, like this is how you put together a persuasive speech, but they don't really teach you for the most part how to actually deliver it. So I can have all the facts down and I can have it structured correctly, but if I'm scared going up there and trying to persuade you or talk in front of you, how persuasive is it actually going to be? Probably not very. And so I realized, as I was sort of moving toward the goal of ultimately becoming an, on camera journalist, television journalist, that I had to also not just get the facts right, but I had to be able to deliver it in a compelling way. I realized I didn't know how to do that well anyway by the time I had graduated from Clemson. And so, and recognizing how fickle that industry is, I went on to get my master's degree. And I definitely didn't have all the dots connected by the time I graduated from UF, but I understood more of them. And so Clemson is not known for their communications program. It has changed a bit, but they were really known for science and engineering. So I would say I learned what I didn't know there. And then I was able to get more internships, create a network through those internships while I was at the University of Florida. And so that, I think, is what helped me. That's what I took away from that experience. That's what still impacts me today.
And if you're of a certain age and grew up on ESPN, Clemson's also known for football, specifically college football.
You
Shout
don't
out
say.
Wow, what a shocker. Shout out Dabo Sweeney. But yeah, listen, especially when you think of in the tri-state area communications programs, people think down in Syracuse, of course, they have a great communications program, which has produced Bob Costas. Fordham has had quite a few, including some that are currently on Channel 4. Communications majors, I should say. Charles Osgood was the most notable one at CBS for many years, and he just passed away. So it's interesting when you go to these programs or colleges that are known for other things, as you just discussed, knowing that they have a communications program there, and how much it's been able to help. Even if it's just preliminary information that you can take, it's something, and it's better than nothing. Now, the beginning of your career is interesting. You go out to Texas.
Yeah.
And this is the beginning of several different markets you would work in that would culminate with New York City in 2015. Where the news business was in 2000 compared to where it is now in 2024, night and day, as you know. But the common theme is this: it's scary as heck as a rookie in any profession. So here you are in a market like this. Everything's bigger in Texas, and you're just starting out. You're learning the area on top of that. For those not familiar with the area, how big is Wichita Falls, Texas, and how long did it take you to acclimate to new surroundings and new beginnings?
Well, because I moved so often when I was young, the move and learning my way around that didn't bother me at all. When I picked what colleges I was interested in, there was a sort of a minimum standard I had, which is it had to be at least 12 hours away from where my home was, where my parents were. I've never wanted, I'm a homebody, but I've always liked exploring new places and meeting new people. So the acclimation in terms of knowing the area, that didn't scare me. What I will say is that it is a very different environment than anything I had been in prior. Where Wichita Falls is, if you're not familiar, it's north central Texas. It's about 2 hours north of Dallas. It's about 2-ish hours south of Oklahoma City. It's like right on the border of Oklahoma. So in fact, our market was a split market. It was Wichita Falls, Texas, and Lawton, Oklahoma. And you have your town of Wichita Falls, which I'm thinking the population was probably about, I don't know, 200,000, not very big. And then you had some of the surrounding areas, right? But they're also very small. Wichita Falls was like the metropolis in the region, and it's very rural in between those areas. So you've got some of these like scattered, some of them were even old sort of, oil towns and mining towns. And then you have Lawton, Oklahoma, which was a little bit smaller than Wichita Falls. So you're in an area that's sparsely populated, but we had a very wide geographic area to cover because things were so spread out. So it did take me a while to learn the area, like I'd have to go out and chase tornadoes by myself. And I had to, we didn't have GPS back then. We had like one of those big old maps, where it's like you get to the bottom and then it's like turn to page A81 to see the rest of the map. And then you're like flipping over, trying to see like where you need to go to either run away from the tornado or get closer to it. So we didn't have
Sounds like
cell
fun.
phones. We had Nextel, which is like a walkie-talkie almost.
Yep.
So there were challenges in retrospect that we all had to overcome. Anybody who starts anywhere had to overcome them, but I didn't see them as technological challenges the way that I the way that I do now.
No, it's funny because I'm harkening back to some of the conversations, like I mentioned, getting a lot of cops and firemen on. The guys in the NYPD Emergency Service Unit back in the day were telling me when they would get called somewhere, and Steve Iarato mentions it in the chat, the Hagstrom map. Where is this? Where in Brooklyn? You're looking at the map with the lights and sirens on the BQE trying to get there. So it's interesting. Reporters faced the similar obstacles back then. And, well, I guess we could stay on that for a second. Covering a tornado and chasing a tornado at that is dramatically different than any other weather experience you can have as a reporter. And, that is tornado country in that part of the country, or that region, I should say, in the country. What is one that sticks out to you as, holy crap, that was something?
Well, so Wichita Falls had one of the biggest tornadoes ever. I think in the history of it, since we've recorded them, in terms of devastation and unfortunately the number of people that died. It was back in the 70s. I want to say it was 72 or 74. I can't remember exactly, but people still talked about it, and you could still see where certain buildings had been repaired, like, the seams, if you will. There were a few, I wouldn't call them high rises, but in the downtown area of Wichita Falls, there were a few buildings that were, 5 or 6 or maybe 7 stories. It didn't get huge, but they were chopped pretty much. One of my very first weekends there as a producer, when I was hired as a weekday reporter and a weekend anchor and producer. And, I sort of figured out the process and the flow, and I, shadowed somebody for a couple of weeks. And then it was like, okay, fly away, little birdie, and do your thing. And I remember being there on a weekend when there were tornado watches going off all day long. And in a station like that, in such a small market, you have a very limited staff. Like your human resources are quite narrow. And so I was there, I was producing the show, also going to be anchoring it that evening, sending the reporters out on their stories, editorial, manager of the show, and also functioning as the assignment desk. So anytime a new tornado warning came through, I would have to like redirect the crews, like, okay, no, now you got to go this way. And it was chaos. And I remember walking outside of the station, which was actually constructed inside of an old abandoned airplane hangar in the middle of a field, and walking outside the door into the parking lot and looking up and seeing like up high, but nevertheless, like 7 funnels in the sky, small. None of them ever, fully formed and touched down. But nevertheless, I was like, I have to somehow pull all of this together. And by the way, I'm still figuring it all out myself. Like, it's held together with silly string and chewing gum. And I would say, despite the fact that I wasn't in imminent danger, none of us were in imminent danger at that point, that was something that I will never forget. The other tornado chasing situation, I guess, that sticks in my mind is I was reporting for the 6 p.m. show, and I was anchoring the 10, but there was a tornado that had touched down, and we didn't have any videographers. And so our assignment manager was like, Kerry, you take the camera. By the way, they're giant. It's not the little mini. This thing is like, it's like putting a bar stool up on your shoulder. That's how big it is, and heavy. And so I loaded up, that crappy old Jeep Wrangler that was, I don't know, 15 years old and had 350,000 miles on it. Was like also held together with silly string and chewing gum, and driving around, just sort of like following the clouds and trying to see where this tornado was coming down. And the rain was so heavy. And I remember I was on this route, this 2-lane highway-ish, but small and in the middle of nowhere, and there was a cop in the middle of the street, and I pulled up to him and he's like, you have to turn around and go the other way. And I'm like, my assignment manager is going to kill me if I do that. So I kept on going like an idiot, but I did, because that's what you do. Like that's what you signed up to do, so you do it. Nothing ever happened. I don't ever think I actually found the tornado. I got out a few times and I shot what I thought could potentially be the storm. I saw lots of swirling clouds, but I don't think I ever actually got the tornado. Nevertheless, to shorten this story up, I will never forget that. And when I recount it in my mind, it sounds ridiculous, because you don't know where you're going. You have no way of getting a hold of anybody. You're in this crappy old car driving toward a tornado by yourself. And you're going to do it for the measly $17,000 a year that they're paying you. What? It was a different day and age. I suppose that'd probably be illegal these days to ask anybody to do that.
I think so. But what do we call that? Youthful ignorance? Because you're so young, you're not thinking about the danger. You think you're invincible.
No.
And then when you get old, you realize, holy crap, I did that.
It's like many times that I could have died.
Yeah. Well, and not even, and not necessarily for a high salary, as you just touched on, but nevertheless, even if the money's not necessarily a high amount, there is that mental aspect of, I want to prove I belong here. So
Totally.
besides storm coverage, I'll ask you this as well. What was the moment during your time in Wichita Falls where you felt, okay, I think I'm starting to find my footing rather,
Yeah.
as a reporter?
I would say it was probably about 6 months in, and it wasn't this one sort of epiphany moment, but I was anchoring, and we had a breaking news. I can't even honestly remember what it was off the top of my head. I think there was it was like a brush fire, but pretty big, and it's very dry there, and there's a lot of open fields. And so when something starts, it can get pretty serious pretty quickly. And we didn't have any resources. All we had was like a tower cam, which, if you not familiar with what that is, if you ever seen like a tall, TV or radio tower, it's however many thousands of feet up, and it's a receiving, right? So you're receiving the signals from the live truck or from network, and you're like retransmitting out to your audience. Anyway, on the top of that thing, we had a little camera. We didn't have a chopper. We had like 5 reporters. So if we wanted to try and find a scene and we couldn't get there and we didn't have a chopper, we'd like rotate the tower cam around this thing and then try and zoom in for this, really pretty crappy grayscale version of whatever it is that we were looking at. And we saw the brush fire. And again, I was anchoring and producing the show at the same time. So, writing the rundown and then also sort of producing from the desk. So like a commercial break would happen and I would have to, we're tight on time. We got to kill this story, or, we're light. We need, the weather guy to stretch or whatever. It's my little guy. So
It's all good. Don't worry.
yeah, I remember in that moment thinking that it was all going to like go straight downhill, and I actually navigated it pretty well. And the breaking news came off, I don't want to say flawlessly, but good. And we managed to keep everything else together. And I think in that moment I was like, oh, okay. Like it wasn't perfect. It may have not even been pretty the entire time, but I figured out that I could navigate whatever was thrown in my way, and I could come out the other side standing. And that was the moment that things changed for me.
Yeah, that's a pivotal moment. We're talking with Kerry Barrett here on the Mike the New Haven podcast. This is our guest for the 309th episode of the podcast. Of course, if you have a question for Kerry, like we said before, throw it in the super chat. My boy Jason Palman, thanks, boy. He contributed $1.99, which is about right for him. That's a good friend of mine, my gym buddy. So I see him popping up in the chat with that $1.99, but nevertheless, it is appreciated. So you go from there to Arizona. Now, this was a very brief tenure for you. It's February to October of 2003 before you went over to Salt Lake City. But nevertheless, I'll ask you a two-part question. One, I mean, the move is understandable. Tell me how the opportunity came about. And two, why such a brief stint, if you don't mind going into it?
Yeah, of course. So actually the move wasn't my idea. I had met my now husband in Wichita Falls, and he at the time was a pilot in the Air Force. His assignment was up in Wichita Falls, and he got reassigned to Luke Air Force Base, which is right outside of Phoenix. As it so happened, my contract, they offered me another, but my contract in Wichita Falls was up at the same time. So they would have let me stay on until his time at Luke was up. He was just finishing up his pilot training there. And so I moved out with him. Sorry, Benjamin, stop. And did you hear that?
Yeah, it's fine. Listen, that's what us sons do. My mom can tell you, even as the baby of the family at 24, I've done that many a time over the years.
Do you still do it?
No, not now.
Okay,
not now. But there was a time in my life where I certainly did. She could tell you. I'm responsible for about 75% of her grace.
Yeah, he's responsible for about 75% of my loss of brain cells. And I wish that I could still ask my mom to make me pizza on Friday. Anyway, nevertheless, I digress. So he was out there for 9 months. I went out with him and just basically went knocking on station doors. Not really, but that's what I did. And said, hey, I'm in town. I can't sign a contract, but I can freelance until, we find out what my husband's next assignment is. It could be here in Luke. It's probably not going to be. So I managed to get a freelance gig at ABC 15, which is the ABC affiliate, KNXV. And it was a permalancer position, meaning it was every day. I reported rather on the morning show, and then I co-hosted their lifestyle sort of news magazine show that was called Sonoran Living that came after the morning show. And so that was a Monday through Friday gig. And then when my husband finished pilot training, his first assignment was Salt Lake City. So same thing happened. I had to follow him, which looking back, I'm still surprised it worked out. This industry is so, you maybe have a handful of positions at any given time in any one market, and they may not be your position. It could have been for a producer or a videographer. There's 4 evening anchors in the entire market. Like there's only, what are the odds that one of their contracts is up or they got let go or whatever? Not very good. So the fact that all of this worked out well is still surprising to me, but that's how that all transpired.
Yeah, and sometimes, listen, what's the saying? In any profession, timing is everything, and the timing was right there. And you mentioning your husband being in the Air Force segues perfectly into one of the questions I had, and that part of your stretch there in Salt Lake City involved being embedded at the Balad Air Base. Now, reporting on local happenings as it pertains to emergency response is always interesting, and I love asking that to reporters. But reporting on the military is something entirely different, and especially getting embedded, you have to have a lot of trust. You have to have a lot of clearances. It's a process just to even be in that position, let alone commence the reporting. So tell me, even though, of course, your husband was in the Air Force, the process of getting cleared, and once you were embedded, the time and the moments and stories rather that stick out from being embedded in such a classic location and often classified location.
So my husband's commander at Hill Air Force Base, which is the Air Force Base in Utah, it's about a half an hour north of Salt Lake City, approached me. They were getting ready to deploy. His squadron was my husband's squadron was getting ready to deploy. My husband's commander's squadron was getting ready to deploy. And he said, we'd love to do a story on the prep for both the airmen and the officers and the enlisted. And do you think you could do that? And I was like, yeah, absolutely, I could do that. But why end there? Why don't we blow this thing up? Why why don't I get a ride in an F-16 and talk about that training? And why don't we do, you know, a 5-part series and, you know, following families as they go through their preparation, and, you know, tracking a family with young kids and the wife who's stateside as they're going through the deployment. And then when they deploy, like the actual moment that the F-16s take off, in this case from Hill Air Force Base, and head over to Balad, it's all very secret. They don't broadcast when and where that's happening. It happens in the middle of the night. And so, you know, I knew when it was happening. So they brought me onto base, and I got all the, you know, I drove my husband there because he was deploying as well. Did all the, you know, final prep in the last hour or two, and then we watched them take off. And so all of that was a challenge in and of itself. Then we had to have escorts bring us over. So we flew from Salt Lake International over to Frankfurt in Germany. We transferred from Frankfurt, Germany to Ramstein, where we picked up a C-130, I think. And that's what took us into Balad, not Baghdad International. That's where we all heard about, you know, that's where a lot of the military planes landed, certainly the journalists that were over there, et cetera. We didn't land at Baghdad International. We landed at Balad, which was an air base. In fact, was Saddam's former Olympic training ground. So it was actually a pretty nice facility. Like they had indoor swimming pools and all sorts of stuff, but that's not what we focused on. We focused on what is it actually like being over there. So we went on supply runs up to Kuwait and Qatar, and we were in the field hospital, you know, where you don't really recognize, like trying to perform life-saving surgery on a extreme trauma patient surrounded by sand that is as fine as talcum. Like all these little things that you don't recognize. I mean, the sand is like talcum powder. It gets in everything. It's impossible to sterilize anything, and the equipment doesn't work properly. It's just there's a whole host of things going on in the background that you don't even really recognize. When we were up in the C-130, we had to do a defensive landing maneuver because, you know, when you're in a certain range from ground to air or air to ground, that's when you're most vulnerable to SAMs, you know, the shoulder to air missiles. And so you fly, you take off, and you land defensively. You're like doing barrel rolls in this C-130, and you're, you know, trying to do a vertical climb basically, and you're all over the place. And so we stood up in the cockpit, and we watched, you know, the altimeter and all that other stuff sort of go wild as we were doing all of these maneuver. It was fascinating. It will always be my career highlight, not just because my husband was part of it, but just because of the experience. I could talk about this story forever. We did a 60-part series on it after we got back.
Wow.
10 of them aired prior, and then I was actually live in Balad every day while I was over there. And then we had a series of follow-up stories as well.
Now, regardless of how one feels about the conflict, which in this case started up back in late 2001 after 9/11, it's one thing to hear about it on the news and see the images for the comfort of one's home. It's another thing to actually be there. And even if you weren't in the war zone itself, you're close enough to what's going on. So to see it up front, I'll say as a secondary question here, how did that impact you once you came back? And how did that make you feel about, just on a human level, what was going on over there, both on the U.S. side and on those living in that region?
Yeah. I would say, I mean, there's a number of different things. I don't want to give anybody the illusion that, you know, they were functioning as like the Army did. The Army, hands down, had the toughest job out there. You know, they're the ones who are sleeping on the sides of mountains, and they're the ones that are over there for 18 months at a time. The Air Force, they're over there for 4 months. If they go any longer, their flying skills deteriorate. They don't allow them to stay over any longer because they don't get as much flight time. However, Balad Air Base was known as, I guess, you know, in a sort of humorous way, the nickname, at least by the men and women who were stationed there, was Mortar Reedaville. It was constantly under mortar attack
Yeah,
You
that's clever.
hear the alarm go off and you dive under your bunk, or you dive wherever, you'd walk around in a flak jacket and a helmet. None of them ever landed near me, but certainly they landed near my husband and near his fellow pilots and support staff. And so that was scary. It's very easy. I'm not a nervous person. And so, people always ask me, like, weren't you nervous when he was in the Air Force? Or he's still a pilot. He just flies for Delta. Aren't you nervous about him flying now? These crazy people and I'm like, if I was nervous all the time, I wouldn't be able to function. I can't be nervous all the time.
It's true.
And I'm just not. But that gave me a different perspective. Not because there were any necessarily extremely close calls, but you sort of imagine when you're not there what it's like. And then when you actually see it, so there's nothing left to the imagination. You can't soften it. It is what it is. And so that was certainly eye-opening. It sounds really silly. Of course it should be eye-opening, but I don't know
That's
that
a perfect way to describe it. Doesn't
recognize.
sound silly at all.
Yeah.
Does not sound silly at all. I think that sums up the emotion that most people would have. And remind me, mind you, I hate aircraft. I'm terrified of aircraft. But if I'm ever going to fly, remind me to pick his plane. I'm pretty sure if that man was dealing with mortars, flying a Delta jet is nothing to him.
Yeah.
So I'll be sure to pick his plane if I ever decide to hop on one again, which I haven't done since the Obama administration, but who's counting? Nevertheless, you spent 5 years there. So it's a little bit different than your first assignment because there's more time to learn the area. Not even on just the work level, just the personal level. In Salt Lake City, it gets overlooked a lot, but it's one of the bigger cities that we've got. There's so many misconceptions out there about it. What did you most come to enjoy about the city and its people in that 5-year stretch?
Well, if you've never been to Utah, I highly suggest it. Northern Utah, Salt Lake City, amazing mountains. The Great Salt Lake, not so much. It's very stinky, but that's fine. It's saline and anyway, you're not going there for the lake. Let's put it that way. The mountains are beautiful, the skiing, the hiking. We love all that stuff. Southern Utah, you've got Bryce and Zion and Grand Escalante, Staircase, all these national parks. It is stunning. Moab. So I love that stuff. I've always been outdoors person, and my husband as well. So we enjoyed that. What I think probably, and Salt Lake has changed quite a bit since I was there. I left in 2008. So we're going on, well, it's been a second. How is that 16 years? I can't even do the math.
16 years. Yep.
That's why I went into journalism. Maths is not my thing. So
you and I both.
The numbers aren't numbering. The city itself is actually probably quite a bit more diverse would be a stretch. It's more diverse now than when I was there, but there really is this very cool, like underground sort of, there's lots of breweries there. It's very clean. And there's actually a fairly good, like sort of indie music concert scene there as well. So I didn't go with any expectation of that, but came to quite enjoy it and relish it. And the people are nice. They're just nice. Mm-hmm. It's a safe place to be.
Mm-hmm. Take that, Dennis Rodman.
Yeah.
who, without going into what he said during the 2 times the Bulls and Jazz faced off in the 1997 and 1998 NBA Finals, respectively, let it be known that he was not a fan of the city, but he is in the minority, as Kerry just pointed out. And it's a great city. I'd like to go visit it someday. Now, here's an interesting step from Salt Lake back to the East Coast to Philly. One of the more major markets we've got, not just on the coast, but also, of course, in the country. And this is a point I wanted to bring up with you. Being a part of something bigger than you is always cool, but being a part of turning something around is even cooler. And this was a station that, at the time, Fox Philadelphia was in third. And if you're in a competitive market where you got 3 or 4 stations duking it out, being second is kind of a black eye for management, let alone being third. You took it from third. And it wasn't just you, it was a team effort, of course, but you were certainly part of it. You took it from third to first. So tell me about getting there and tell me about the gradual process culminating in that holy crap moment. We're in first place, baby.
Yeah. I don't know if if there was ever like really that moment, because you're always like waiting for the other shoe to drop.
That's true.
You
Right.
never start patting yourself on the back. And that's probably something I need to learn to do a little bit more. I very rarely celebrate the wins or the milestones because I think I'm conditioned from the news industry to just wait for like
You're still unweaving that,
the next big thing to happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we moved there. Again, I left Salt Lake City. My husband had just not retired, but had left the Air Force and had picked up a job at the New Jersey Air National Guard, still flying F-16s, and also was now flying for Delta. And so, we sort of had, we had two places really with markets that we could move into that would work with his job. It was Philly or it was New York. And I'm like, New York is, I think, probably going to be more difficult for me coming from Salt Lake City, right? New York's market number 1, Philly's market number 4. Still big, but it's not number 1. So we moved to Philly. I started freelancing at the Fox station there. This was in 2008, right after the whole financial crash, Lehman Brothers and all that other craziness that happened. And so there was a moratorium on hiring. Every station was under a hiring freeze. I was lucky that I got a freelancing job at Fox and I was reporting, and that was probably about nine-ish months to a year. And then my boss started putting me in to fill in when an anchor was out. Started on the weekends, then it was on the evenings, and then it was on the mornings. And that gradually transpired into getting offered a job anchoring the morning show, as it so happens, while I was pregnant with my first kiddo. So that morphed like into a full-time job, just like it had in Phoenix. And I don't know how much you know, Fox stations, local Fox stations, their evening shows are notoriously, I don't want to paint everybody with a broad brush, but their morning shows usually perform pretty well. Their evening shows are the ones that generally struggle. And so moving into that evening role was amazing. I had some great co-hosts, co-anchors, really solid production team behind us, and we did really, really well. And then I was moved to the morning show, which by the hours may seem like it was a demotion, but their morning show was strong, and I was brought in to help keep it that way. So it was a great opportunity.
You brought up something interesting, and we could highlight it further here in that the compare and contrast between the morning show and the evening show. Do you feel that the evening shows may not do as well because, well, people are getting home from work, they're just settling in, they maybe don't have as much time, or if it's nice outside, the summer months in particular, people are getting ready to go out for the night. Would you say that's the reason why, or are other factors in play as to why evening shows versus morning shows may not perform as good?
I that's an interesting question. Traditionally, the evening shows have always been the marquee shows. They've always been, the 11 p.m. with, Chuck Scarborough or, right, and Sue Simmons. Traditionally, it has not worked that way for Fox stations. And I think there's probably a couple of reasons. Number one, the other shows are all on at 11. Fox went on at 10. They also didn't have any network programming around them. So for example, if you remember, well, you don't remember because you're not old like me, but back there was appointment viewing on NBC on Thursday night. It was like Friends, Seinfeld, and I can't remember what the other two are. And that led directly into their 11 p.m. programming. Fox local didn't have that. There's not a Fox network outside of their cable, right? Fox News Channel. So they didn't have the benefit of really strong lead-ins to their evening programming. That's why Fox morning shows are 6 hours, and every other morning show is like 2, because every other morning show then goes to the Today Show, where Fox has to fill that with their own local programming, which is why their morning shows are so long. Everything is changing now. I guess to answer your question is there's a number of things that sort of there's a confluence of a number of different things that go into making Fox, specifically evening shows, perhaps not as strong as some of the other competitors. Again, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't know who's watching. I'm painting with a broad brush. I'm making a broad generalization. The reason I think Fox morning shows have traditionally fared better than their evening is because the shows were so long, and because morning audiences are so habitual and are so connected with, who wants to be up at 3:30 in the morning? Like nobody, not the viewer, not the anchor, not the reporter. So you're all
That's
sort
true.
of in this like foggy place together where you bond. And because the shows were, because of that, and because the Fox programming, their morning shows are so long, there's really a great opportunity there for like riffing and ad-libbing. Fox morning programs tend to be very personality driven, which means the audience has a better opportunity to make a deeper connection with the host. And I think that translates into more habitual viewing, more dedicated and committed viewers, and the feeling like they really know who's on their set delivering them the news. And I think that is what brings those higher ratings.
Yeah, and you know what? It's interesting because now, having been a news junkie as a kid, my mother could certainly tell you, watching Fox in particular, living in New Haven, we get all the stations.
Yeah.
So I would get the Connecticut Fox station, Fox 61 in our case, but I would also get Fox 5. Most of the time, their best lead-in is a ball game. It's the
Yeah.
Yankee game, or it's the Fox game of the week. And if you grew up watching WPIX, same thing. It was right after the Met game. Watch whatever newscast it was, or right after the Yankee game, same thing. So when you're working off something that's seasonal, you got to compensate a lot for that.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's certainly something they've gotten good at doing over the years. But I'm glad I asked you that, because I'm like, it's an interesting compare and contrast. And you highlighted it perfectly. We're all up, or most people are up at that hour of the morning. So it makes sense that we would all commiserate over something like that.
Yeah.
In the evenings, where we kind of go our separate ways, you
Yeah.
know? But that's definitely an interesting point. Now, during your time in Fox Philadelphia, it's not easy to open up about personal struggles, whatever they may be, but that's something that you did. And oftentimes, and I'll let you dive into it further, oftentimes the common theme as to why people go into their personal problems is when they ask someone, why did you choose to share that? I want to help others who may be going through the same thing. So for you, for the audience that may not know, what were those struggles and what prompted you, besides what I just mentioned, to put that out there?
Yeah. So you're referring, I believe, about a story I did on a series of miscarriages that I had.
Yes.
I had no problem at all with, my first, and came to trying for the second, and I had 4 miscarriages, all fairly early on, maybe showing a little bit, but people would ask, viewers would ask, like, are you pregnant? They'd send an email or they'd send a tweet, and maybe it was that I had just miscarried and hadn't lost the weight yet, or maybe I was, but I didn't want to share because I had known that there was a good chance that this wasn't going to take. And it was a really rough time. And my boss, one of them at the time, was also struggling with fertility issues. And so we would talk about it, and she's like, have you ever considered, would you consider basically doing a story on this? And at first I sort of dismissed it. And then I reconsidered, and I thought, it's the opposite of what you learn as a journalist. Like, you're not really supposed to be the story, but there's also very few people that want to talk about it, number one. And number two, getting questions from viewers like, are you pregnant? Which, by the way, don't ask anybody that question. I mean, don't ask
don't.
it. I mean, what? I was. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I decided that it would be a good opportunity, not just to share what was going on with me, but also sort of wrap other people into it who I know were experiencing the same thing. And as nerve wracking as that was, or as sort of scary as that was, and I did, there are plenty of people who were like, I can't believe you're making yourself the story, which was not at all the intent. But I also, on the other side, had thousands of people email and tweet and DM me like, I always thought you had it so easy, and I was so jealous about how easy you had your first child, and I didn't realize this was going on behind the scenes, and I'm dealing with the same thing too, and nobody understands. They tell me like, oh well, it's a good thing, it's God's way of like taking care of issues or whatever, the platitudes people say to try and make you feel better. Also, don't say those.
Yeah, don't.
Um,
Please don't.
yeah, don't. And I realized that there was something to be said here in a deeper way, and it ended up certainly being a cathartic experience with me. That wasn't the really what I went into it hoping for, but my goal is, and I think we achieved this certainly, that we like talked about an issue that people still don't talk about. This is
Mhm.
a long time ago, and people struggle to sort of come to terms with.
Right. And it removes that stigma, kind of like what we're doing now with mental health. Same thing, remove the stigma.
Yeah.
If you remove the stigma, it's easier to talk about, which is a positive. And thank you for sharing that. And on a more humorous note, for all the guys out there, take it from me. I grew up the only boy in my house with nothing but women. If you have to think, should I ask this question to her? You probably shouldn't ask it.
Yeah.
Just a rule of thumb and a good word of advice. Don't
Don't
ask me
ask
how I
age,
know.
don't ask weight, don't ask are you pregnant. Those are the
Bingo.
three that you can safely extricate from your conversation.
At all times, might I add, at all times.
Yes.
How do I know? Totally don't have PTSD from having done that when I was younger. Not at all.
Oh no. Oh
Not
dear.
at all. You live and you learn,
I
and
forgive you.
yeah, you have so much pain in the meantime, but you learn. Before I get to WNBC, of course, there's a prospect. Well, two things I want to ask before I get to that. There's a prospect of doing some notable interviews. We'll touch on that momentarily, but there's that cool moment in your career, speaking generally, where you're like, oh, wow, I got some skin in this game. I've been around a while.
Yeah.
People were teaching me. Now I can give back and teach others. The intern,
Yeah.
the new reporter that just got there, anybody, you could take them under your wing, so to speak. What were some of the more rewarding moments when you got to that stage in your career where you were able to share some knowledge with younger ones coming into the business?
Yeah. There's a few actually. Paula Reed was an intern at Fox when I was there as an anchor. She now is a reporter and anchor on CNN. She's one of their chief political correspondents. She's spectacular, but I remember her coming out on stories with us and her asking questions as we were heading to a polling location for some election. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but like walking her through, like, this is how this works, and these are the questions you can ask and the things that you can't, and we can get this close, but not, we have to just all of the sort of civics lessons that they don't really teach you in college, even in journalism. You have to figure out how to like navigate the court system if you're covering a story in the courthouse, or all that stuff. So that has been a very cool, I don't know if it's a full circle moment, but it's been very cool to see her star rise, if you will, at CNN. And then there was an intern at WNBC actually who I worked with, and she lived in Philly and had seen me there, and I helped her negotiate her first contract, and ask for this. If they won't give you this, ask them for that, and they can give you that, so don't take no for an answer, and here's how you ask for it. And now she's actually working in Philly. She's working at ABC Channel 6 there, WPVI, which is like the powerhouse station in that market. It's awesome to see her.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've had former co-anchors, like even from Wichita Falls, who who have said, we have a reporter here and I think she's pretty good, but she can't seem to find her next job. Can you take a look at her demo reel and give her some advice? Like, what is she doing wrong on the demo reel? And so I would, and the demo reel, for those who aren't familiar, is sort of a compilation of your on-air work that you send in with your resume or your application or whatever the process is for the particular job that you want. And then your news director or hiring manager, whoever it is, will watch. And that's really what it comes down to. Their only interest, that is so much more important than where you went to school, what stories that's pretty much all they look at. They look at the demo tape first. And if they like you in the first 5 seconds, they may continue watching, and then they'll look at your resume. And even if they don't like what's on the resume, if they like your reel, you're probably going to be in for an interview. So the demo reel is super important. And you don't know how to make them. Like, nobody teaches you how to do that in school. It's sort of a trial and error, and so that was nice as well, to be able to, this is the stuff you should have on it. Let me look through your material. Let me help you piece this together, edit it, whatever it is, and then you can use it to get your next job. So all of those were great experiences.
Oh, of course. And people remember that. They may not remember exactly what you may have said, although some certainly do, but they'll remember how you treated them. They know those who scoffed at them, and they know those who were kind enough and humble enough to extend a helping hand. And that's going to go a long way towards one's reputation. And if you ever turn around and by chance you may need something down the road, they remember what you did for them, and they're able to repay that favor to you. Yeah. So it goes hand in hand. It's just so, and it's, what the tragic part about this, Kerry, is that it's, as you know, I don't have to tell you, I'm preaching to the choir. It's so easy to do this, but so many people don't do it.
Yeah.
It's the most basic thing you can do. Just be kind. And so many people in the workplace just refuse to do it.
Yeah, I used to think that was very limited to the news industry. There's this sharp elbow crowd there, but that's across the board. That's a challenge, I think.
Yeah, unfortunately. Unfortunately. And the other question before I get to WNBC and the hour mark, we're coming up on, it's flown by. It's been a great conversation with you. Got a couple more things to cover with you. Is as a reporter with more tenure, and definitely as an anchor too, you get the chance to do longer form interviews. If you're interviewing somebody on the street, let's say a structure fire just happened, you're interviewing the fire chief. It's different. That's a very quick interview. But if you're sitting down with somebody for a story that'll air later, you have time to edit it. It's your baby. It's a lot cooler to do that because you can naturally get more out of the person. For those interviews, if you were able to do some, and I imagine you were, what are the ones that really stick out as the most fun, the most engaging, insightful?
Oh my gosh. You're really asking me to go back a decade or two, aren't you? I would say still probably that some of the best long form interviews are the ones that I did as they related to the story in Iraq. They weren't celebrities. I've interviewed celebrities, and they're fun, but that's more of like, the spit and polish and the like,
cheeky
too. Which is fine. It's fun. But in terms of like real depth or sort of I may be making this too grand, but a life changing or affirming or whatever interview, I would say for sure it's the people I spoke with, the families, the airmen, those who were deployed, the commanders, the Iraqis in some cases over there in Balad, talking to the people who live there. Those were the stories and the interviews that will stick with me forever.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that's a very easy answer to give. And ultimately, it's the right one. There's nothing more impactful than that. So that does bring us to 2015 and getting to Channel 4 now. It's interesting to highlight anybody that's coming into the New York City market. Very few people start there. Maybe the people that grew up in the area, it's easier to get your foot in the door if you know the area, having lived in it. But you've bounced around, even though you were in Philly a very long time. You were in Utah a fairly long time, 15 years in the business. And I feel like that prepares one well for this. So again, we'll talk about the opportunity and talk about just walking into a legendary place like 30 Rock, where the Chuck Scarboroughs, the Sue Simmons, the Len Bermans of the world have walked through those doors. What was that like for you?
It was, I don't want to say it was heady, but it was a little heady, walking through the hallways and you're seeing I mean, there's no telling who you could walk down. Either President Obama could have been there. J-Lo, maybe you're walking down the hallway and she and her entourage come by. There's always something going on. I don't get too wrapped up in that stuff. I would say most of us don't. It's nice to be in that legendary building, but at the end of the day, like, we're doing the same thing. I'm doing the same thing there that I did in Wichita Falls, Texas. I'm just doing it with a couple more bells and whistles. But that's not to denigrate that experience at all. Like, who doesn't like to say they worked with legends in their industry and walked into 30 Rock every day as their place of business? It was pretty awesome. The crazy thing is that I never really aspired to end up in New York. I just didn't. I wanted to end up in a top 15 market, but I mean, that could have been Minneapolis or like Tampa.
Yeah.
Or Orlando for that matter. So that was really the goal that I had set for myself. And really going back almost to probably halfway through my tenure in Salt Lake City, I had started to grow somewhat disillusioned with the industry, not the people that I worked with, but just the state of news and the challenges that it was facing, especially as it dealt with social media and the web and all that other stuff. It's an industry in the state of contraction is probably the best way to put it. It's not a growth industry anymore. Anyway, and I was wrapping up my contract in Philly, and really they had offered me another. And I was at that point seriously considering just getting out of the business entirely. And, my agent called me up one day and was like, New York is interested in having you, come up and interview. And I was like, well, okay, sure. And so I took the Acela up and I interviewed one day after anchoring the morning show in Philly. And I guess, as they say, the rest is history. It took a while. It was like 8 weeks later. I hadn't heard back, but eventually the offer came in, and there I went.
And if I'm not mistaken, those 4 years there, although you had a slew of different assignments, of course, were you primarily with the Today in New York team?
I was. Yep.
Okay. So talk about a nucleus, right? And that nucleus was there for about a decade. You had, and they're still there, most of them: Michael Gargiulo, Darlene Rodriguez, of course. And then you had Chris Cimino on weather, and he's since moved on to PIX. And you had Lauren Scala, who she's still at NBC, but she's just not on the Today in New York squad anymore. She's over on New York Live. So there's the nucleus, and you're complimenting them. And particularly in Darlene and Michael's case, they've been there for such a long time. So they're kind of like the bedrocks of that particular squad. What was it like working with them, and what qualities, just focusing on those four, and we'll get to other coworkers that you had there as well, but focusing on those four, what's your favorite quality of each person?
Oh my gosh. Darlene is funny, and she knows everything about everything in New York. Like, there's not a corner of that city. This probably could be said for all of them, but it's one of the first things that I learned about her in talking to her. Like, there's not a corner of that city she doesn't know. Michael Gargiulo is one of the kindest, sweetest, like, give you the shirt off of his back kind of guy that I've ever come across. And I've worked with some, I can't swear on this. I've worked with some real, and I've worked with, that's the word I was looking for. And so I'm always you're always sort of tiptoeing into a new environment. Like, I want to be assertive, but not too assertive. I want to, they need to like me. We need to have chemistry. And I don't, there's a whole, like any new job and any person, there's a bunch of, you're tiptoeing around until you understand the politics. What I learned very quickly with that group is that there's no politics. They're just great people. So Michael and Darlene are like salt of the earth, very beautiful, salt of the earth people who are also very kind. Lauren Scala, absolute same. She was actually the first person. We were riding in an Uber, I think. I don't know if it was we were getting headshots done or something, and she just sort of opened up and told me everything I needed to know about who does what, who's really good at this. If you need this done, here's who you go. Like, just sort of laid it all out there. I don't want to say took me under her wing, but kind of did. She's a gem. and Chris is a legend in his own right. I didn't get to work with him as much because of just the way our schedules were aligned and where he was located in the station in the weather center and where I was. But also just they're fantastic people. They really are. Like a lot of people say, "Oh, I like the people I work with." I really do like the people I work with. They're
Yeah.
great.
And
Yeah.
it's fun to have a job like that. And it's funny you bring that up
Yeah.
because I was having that conversation with my mother the other day, where I work for a fire department in Connecticut. I'm not a firefighter, but I work on the media side handling
Sure.
their social media. And it's great. It's so much fun. And it doesn't it take a weight off you when you're
Oh,
happy you're going to work in the morning because not only do you enjoy the job, but you enjoy the people. It's so refreshing.
it's a gift. I don't think I realized how much of a gift it was until I worked with a couple of those jerks.
Yeah.
And then working with people who are actually like kind and honest and upfront is just a breath of fresh air.
hmm I don't
Yeah.
know how closely you worked with her, but I do want to ask you about her. And just in case you have a story or two that you can share, one person who was also a cornerstone of that team, and unfortunately she passed away. Hard
Yeah.
to believe now. It's been 3 years. Catherine Craig.
Yeah.
And what a loss she was. I mean, you talk about another person who nobody had a bad word to say about that woman
No.
when she was with us, and certainly not now posthumously. I don't know how much interaction you had with Kat, as she was affectionately known, but if you did, what's a memory that you can share of her?
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, she was absolutely the light of any room that she was in, not because she demanded attention, but because people just gravitated to her. She like
I've heard.
glowed. And I don't know how she did it because she has 3 kids also, and I do as well. And like, listen, when I got up in the morning, I looked like I spent the night wrestling with a bag of hammers. Like, it was not pretty. I don't know how she did it. Her skin was always flawless. She was always full of energy. She always had a smile on her face. I remember going to our tiny, as we call it, Today in New York Christmas party. And she and one of our videographers would always make us do this sort of pyramid where there was like a base of people. And then, we just like the cheerleaders were too. And I remember standing on top of her thigh at one of these Christmas parties. And I can't even remember where we were, some restaurant somewhere. And her laugh would make you laugh. She had like this deep, rich voice. And yeah, she's awesome. Her loss was an incredibly tough blow for the entire newsroom, not just the morning show.
Oh yeah, and it still
Yeah.
felt. It still felt. And I wanted to ask that question not for the purpose of sadness, but as the audience knows, same thing with my police and fire interviews when we talk about their colleagues who've been killed in the line of duty. I always like to focus on how the person lived, not necessarily
Yeah.
how they died. And again, when I had Chris Amino on a few years ago, same thing. Nobody has a bad word to say about
Yeah.
her. She was somebody that, as he said, and as you just said, lit up the room and not only brought so much on the camera, she was a heck of a reporter,
Yeah.
but brought so much off of it too. And when you
Yeah.
have people like that, you hold them and you never let go. And when they
Mhm.
leave, either because they move on to other jobs, or in this case, unfortunately, she left us much too soon. It's definitely felt. It's a palpable loss. It's a
Yeah.
palpable loss for sure. So I'm glad you shared some memories of her. Before I get to leaving in 2019, again, much like I asked you about Philly, it's New York City. Things are happening a million miles a minute. What's a story that you had a personal involvement in, either on a breaking news sense or just a general story sense that sticks out to you from that particular stretch in your career?
Boy, my gosh, it was always jumping. I would say, I guess probably the easy answer is the one that I won the Emmy for,
There
which
you
was
go.
breaking news coverage. It was the Tribeca crane collapse back in 2016, I guess. Yeah, February 15th of 2016.
I remember that.
And I remember, I think Michael might have been off that day. Darlene and I anchored, and it was, I don't even remember how many hours of coverage. I feel like it was like 10 or 11 straight hours of coverage. And I want to say it came together. Breaking news never comes together flawlessly, but there's such a good team there, and the producers are so they're so steady. Oftentimes if you get a new or a green or a nervous producer, and it's perfectly understandable, they're talking in your ears, things are going on, and they're sort of like ratcheting up the nervous energy, and like you don't really know if they have control of the situation. You don't want to produce from it. You're sort of like, do I go? Do I not go?
Yep.
The producers there were just like, okay, they'd be in my ear. When Darlene's done asking this question, you're going to cut in and say, oh, we have so-and-so on the line. So-and-so is blah, 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 blah. By the way, this person saw yada, yada, yada. So get the conversation started by asking about that. And it was just such a well-oiled machine that you were never left hanging. Even in this chaotic situation where everything is unfolding in the moment, you were never left hanging. There was always somebody that was guiding you as to what was coming next, because the viewer only sees the anchors up there, and there's a real good chance that if things are going poorly in the production booth, you're going to see it as a viewer on the desk. And I've been in that situation before where you're left hanging, you're sort of just twisting out there waiting for somebody to sort of tell you what's coming up or where they want you to go. And that team they are pros. Like,
oh yeah,
separate the boys from the men and the girls from the women there. They are remarkable.
Yeah. And calm is contagious, as I've said many times before on this show. If you're calm, you're not like Will Ferrell. I forget the movie. We just got to stay calm and keep our composure, as he throws a chair against the locker room. I think it might have been Tropic Thunder. But, so you don't want to be that person, because if you're yelling and screaming, even a veteran anchor is going to get thrown off by that. And is it an intense situation? Yes. It's not every day a crane comes crashing down. And unfortunately, in that case, killed a gentleman who was trying to run away. Or other incidents that we've seen that have happened in the city over the years. But nevertheless, if you're calm, it calms the viewer down too. Because imagine an anchor's panicking. If you're watching that at home, it's already a daunting situation enough that you're watching unfold, and that could scare you too. Now, leaving in 2019, I watched a video you posted on, I think, both your Instagram and LinkedIn a little while ago, where one of the reasons why you left, you stated, was you felt you just couldn't be present anymore. It kind of, and I'm paraphrasing, just sucked the life out of you. And you were thinking about leaving as it was, but you wanted to be more present with your family. And as you said, you would just be on the couch and, because it's a job that, although you loved it, it does beat you up. Yeah. So much like we kind of talked about earlier, was it a series of moments that made you finally say in 2019, okay, this has been fun, but it's really time to walk away? Or was there one moment that made you say, okay, this is enough?
No, there was not one moment. Like I said, I had going back to my time in Utah, which, to refresh the audience's memory, was 2003 through 2008. So some time ago. I had started to grow sort of I love morning TV. I love the spontaneity. I love the connection with the audience. Like I said, they're habitual viewers, and it's usually a very tight-knit group, people who are on the morning show. I love all that. I don't love getting up at 1:30 in the morning. I'm not a morning person. Nobody's a 1:30 in the morning person, but I'm not even like an 8 a.m. morning person. So it had always been a battle for me. And then with my third child, I was a disaster. Like, no friends, no social life, honestly, like marriage kind of on the rocks, because I was so angry all the time because I was so flippin' tired. And I had surpassed my shelf life in that role. And probably they were sick of me as well. I don't want to say they were sick of me. It wasn't like that, but like it was clear that I was not happy, and I was bored. Bored is probably a good way to put it as well. And when my contract was up, it was time to go. My cat is sitting on my remote control.
Hi, Kitty. Welcome. Making a special guest appearance.
He's fine.
We saw him earlier.
Yeah. I had built a runway. Like, it was sort of last minute. I was like, this is it. I'm, however old I was at that point. I can't even remember. I can't do the math, but
that's okay.
I'm actually going to get out. It's time to get out now and figure out what the next step is. And I also mentioned a couple of times during the course of this interview that the news industry is one that is in a state of contraction, meaning it's constant layoffs, across the board. ESPN, Sports Illustrated, certainly applies to radio, print, TV as well. CNN just went through a huge round of layoffs, all of them. And that is only that has been sort of the scenario since 2001 or 2, really, when the internet became a full-fledged thing.
Yeah.
And then social media on the heels of that. Everybody's sort of curating their own news feed here, and they're not watching news anymore. And so that also sort of pushed me out, because I recognize, I could work here, or I could, try and find another job somewhere else. But really, how much longer do I have, as a woman? And I hate to bring up that sort of tired old trope, but it's true. Your shelf life is, unless you're, a rock star, somewhat limited to some degree, especially when you have hit a certain, pay level. And the industry itself is sort of just in a state of decline. So am I going to wait an additional however many years and then try and figure it out? Or, my little guy at the time was 2-ish. Am I going to jump out now and figure out what comes next? And that's what I did. Again, I didn't have a runway planned at all. I thought I was going to go into PR. I obviously didn't end up doing that, but it was a long time coming, to answer your question. I was ready.
It's understandable.
Before to leave. Yeah.
It's understandable. And you're not the only person I've seen do that. I mean, you and I both know Patrice Polster. Same thing. She left, and she's doing great for herself now.
Yeah.
I mean, she just moved to Portugal, for crying out loud, because of how well she's doing. And I remember having this conversation. I don't know if you remember her. She used to be on PIX, and then she went to Houston. Caitlin Money, same thing. There was a woman who had accomplished a whole heck of a lot.
Yeah.
But same thing. She reached her breaking point where she said a few years ago, and she's got 3 kids too. All right, listen, it's just time to go. And if you don't make that move, I mean, there's literally that now or never moment in your life, which is, I don't want to, what's more important to me? This job, I love it, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's about one's family. And clearly you've made the right choice. And look at the last 5 years, going into consulting, having so much fun with that, and helping people show up on camera. It's something that's become so easy, you would think, with something like this, right? Where you could just literally turn your camera on and, hi, here I am, especially with social media exploding as it has. But it's hard for people. And yet you've been able to help them climb that mountain. So promote yourself, girl. Kerry Barrett Inc. Tell us about it.
Well, thanks. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is, we in our industry, and I'm going to say media as a whole, because you do something similar. You create podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. For us, maybe it wasn't always easy for me. I don't know if it was easy for you, but this was a skill set, talking on camera, speaking, et cetera, that I really had to work at. Not just work at it to get over the fear, but work at it to get good enough so that somebody would pay me to do it. And that was a challenge. It took me a while, but their goals for wanting to be on camera are certainly different than mine are. But an executive, a lawyer, which is shocking, because you'd think they'd be great at speaking, they're pit bulls in the courtroom, but many of them are not so great when they're in front of the camera. And so mostly I work with executives and lawyers, but I do also work with small and medium business owners who are looking to leverage speaking and camera skills for revenue, really, for client acquisition, for visibility, for awareness, for position themselves as experts, and for media opportunities. It's interesting. I have a client now who's crazy good on TikTok and Instagram Reels. She has 1 million followers, and she's very good at what she does. However, she freaks out when she has a television appearance. And I think it's just the difference between live versus having post-production, and it's a longer format, and she picks herself apart. She's quite good, but it's a different format. So while the basic skills are the same, creating video for your business on social media and speaking on a webinar for sales or client education or getting on TV and doing a spot on, CNBC or Fox Business or whatever your jam is. The skills are the same. Communication skills are the same across all of them, but the way they're applied are slightly different. And most of us anyway, have some sort of trauma incident around public speaking, which is why so many of us absolutely loathe it. But if you're a business owner or you're an executive, you don't really have a choice. You have to do it. And so I work with those types.
Yeah, and it's different ways how people can overcome that fear. For me, it's going to sound funny, but as you could tell by the off-air conversations me and my brother were having, I'm a sports guy. Even though this podcast is primarily first responders mixed in with sports and news interviews, at my heart, I'm a sports guy.
Yeah.
And I grew up a child of WFAN, which for those of you that grew up in the New York City area, you know that station. Calling into WFAN, and even if it was a 2-minute phone call talking about who should be batting fifth in the Yankee lineup, which in hindsight, what the heck was I doing? Nobody cares about that. But whatever, it's something I did during my teen years. That taught me, even though you couldn't see my face, I was on the radio, nevertheless, a nationally syndicated radio station. Even if it's for a minute and a half, it taught me how to speak on a public stage.
Yes.
And I'm grateful, even though I sounded so ridiculous during those caller years, for that experience, because by doing that, it kind of allowed me to climb over that hill and do what I'm doing now, because you're thinking about it, and there's a million different things. What do I say? What do I not say? How do I segue? And you could really be your own worst critic that way. But by sitting down with someone, as I'm trying to do now with this new endeavor in consulting, saying, hey, don't overthink it. The KISS method, right? Keep it simple, stupid, as a friend of mine told me. It goes a long way.
Sure
but it's
does.
something that so many people can't see the forest from the trees from. I'm not knocking them. It's just you get so deep in your own head. It's hard to.
We all have. It's been surprising to me. I think I didn't fully appreciate the fear that people have around this, which is kind of crazy because I struggled with the same thing. But I always look at somebody who is, let's say, a C-level executive at a large corporation and think they've got it all together. There's nothing that scares them. They have confidence out the wazoo. Like they walk into any room and just own it. And that's not true. But they're also, most of them, hesitant to admit it. Like those big clients that I usually get them from LinkedIn. They've seen content somewhere and they, DM me, or their handler usually DMs me and says, we need some training for yada, yada, yada. But they've never engaged. They've never dropped a comment in the questions. They've never even, usually they're not even following me. Because they don't want anybody to know. They don't want to even engage in public, because why would they be watching somebody who's talking about being afraid on camera? They're not afraid, and they're not arrogant, but we're all sort of afraid to admit that we have these fears. Like we're worried about failure, we're worried about rejection, and we're worried about loss of status, and we're worried about people laughing at us. And if we fail at something, it confirms like every horrible thing that we've ever thought about ourselves in the past, and every mean thing that everybody's ever said. You could be making multi-7 digits a year, and a bully from 5th grade still affects the way that you feel about yourself. That's a real story. And it's crazy because from the outside, you'd never assume it. But we all deal with it in some way or another, some of us better than others. And kudos for recognizing when you need a little bit of help and asking somebody to help you.
That's the first step. And it's funny you bring that up because, I also watched some MMA as a kid. And George St. Pierre, for those of you who are MMA fans, you remember George St. Pierre Rush. Guy's one of the greatest of all time. 26 wins, only 2 losses. And he said as a kid, he'd get beat up. I'm thinking, you got beat up? Yeah, I'm watching you knock people out and make people submit, and you got beat up? But what's the point? Everybody has to start somewhere. But that growth process doesn't help, or doesn't start, I should say, unless you reach out, unless you look for what's around you. And if it's camera work, or if it's something that you want to do to expand a podcast, whatever it may be, there's people out there in every field who are darn good at it. So if you can reach out, listen, by all means, do that. And we put your links in the description of this episode. So if there's any of you out there, hey, go ahead, reach out to Kerry, and her experiences across 19 years in the news business will certainly guide you on where you need to be. This conversation has been great, but we're not done yet because it's time for the rapid fire. That's 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you, featuring you and the kitty in the background. You can say pass if you want. First one is funniest story you've ever covered.
Funniest story I've ever what?
Covered.
Funniest story I've ever covered was Benjamin, my gosh, I'm sorry.
He
Hold
needs
on,
pizza.
Benjamin.
It's all right.
Funniest word is, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can say this one on air.
We could say it off air. We could pass.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna. Let's just say it had to do with a tattoo on somebody's junk.
All right. Well, there you go. Most uplifting story you ever covered.
Most uplifting story I've ever covered was the story of a woman who had had a hell of a time with an abusive ex, had emerged from that relationship traumatized, but with a mission to start her own sort of recovery home, if you will, or program for other women who had been in abusive relationships, and it was a healing process for her as well, and for the women that we spoke with. It was amazing.
This is very important.
Very
You want to take a break? We'll give you a break. Go ahead.
What do you need, buddy?
We'll put you in the back room while she handles that. We'll rapid fire. She's momming, and she is doing the podcast at the same time. That's Kerry Barrett. We'll get back to the rapid fire in a second. Let me give a shout out to John Costello and a couple people for the super chat. To MC to keep the lights on, senior citizen on fixed income. You're talking about your pension, John. And Billy Ryan, I forgot to mention you earlier. And that is another great show, an interesting guest. And hello to Benjamin. I see you waving in the back, buddy. Thanks for joining. And of course, I mentioned you earlier, Jason Palma. Thanks for the super chat. You know, we do need the super chat during the show, so whatever amount you can give is key, and we certainly do appreciate the contributions we've had tonight. We'll go back to Kerry now. I think the third question, the rapid fire, was Philly cheesesteak or New York pizza?
Oh God, New York pizza. I'm not a cheesesteak fan.
And there you go. All right. Fourth, best advice anyone ever gave you?
Best advice anybody ever gave me was ask for what you want. Ask for what you want, take what you get, use what you get to get what you need or what you want. Hold on, I'm distracted now. Ask for what you want, ask for what you need, take what you get, use what you get to get what you want. That's the expression.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
It made sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. I just have to write it down to remember it. Yeah, at least it's not in Latin, like the thing hanging over my office, which I'm sure it's inspirational, but I don't know what it means. Finally, in this rapid fire, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, but with this Kerry Barrett, tell a young Kerry Barrett.
Oh my gosh, none of that stuff, none of it matters. I spent so long morphing myself into trying to be somebody that everybody liked that I completely lost who I was. And that was a much harder process than just developing myself to begin with.
Good advice to remember. You can't, and not everybody's going to like you. You know, it's nice if somebody does, or if everybody does rather, but there's always going to be that occasional person. And I think it's not even just you sometimes. Sometimes it's just that person. But we talked about tonight, getting deep into your head can really mess you up. So that's good advice. Kerry, stick around. We'll talk off the air. Don't sign off just yet. But before I say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs to anyone or anything that you would like to give?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. Your show was awesome, by the way.
Thank you.
You have a great audience and you're such a good interviewer.
Oh, thank you.
Really, you are. And you've got a great voice, all of the things. And I thank you to the audience. This is an audience shout out. Thank you for being here. I know it's late on a Friday night, so I appreciate it.
Oh, they're great. They treat me well. Thanks to everybody that tuned in, and we'll listen to this later on audio. And for everybody, once again, who contributed in the super chat. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, 2 NYPD shows. He was a transit cop in the New York City subways during the 80s and 90s, which was not an easy beat, but hey, he did it, and he'll be here to tell me his stories. Pete Brazil for next Wednesday, and next Friday was a scuba diver in the New York City Police Department, I believe, when TWA Flight 800 went down in 1996. He's one of the divers recovering the debris used in that investigation. His name is George Sickler. So 2 PD shows on tap for next week, Wednesday and Friday, respectively. Be here. Don't miss it. Both awesome guests. Coming up tonight was an awesome guest. And on behalf of producer Victor, my dog nephew Jack's in the background, who he's been wrangling with the whole night. And of course, Kerry Barrett. I am Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Have a great night, everybody. Stay safe.